Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights and let the quiet hum of a medieval monastery wrap around us. A place where the scent of old parchment and beeswax hung heavy in the air, and the greatest adventures often unfolded in the hushed glow of a flickering candle. You find yourself kneeling on cold flagstones, feeling the ancient chill seep into your bones, observing the disciplined rhythm of life lived by quill and prayer. But don't worry, this isn't about becoming a monk, although, let's be honest, those early wake-up calls might make getting more sleep a tad difficult for you. This is about discovering something truly extraordinary within those quiet walls. Something small, something utterly unexpected. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are here, within the thick stone walls of the Benedictine Abbey of St. Martin, nestled deep in a secluded valley, far from the clamor of bustling towns and the rumble of passing carts. The air is always cool, even in summer, carrying the faint, earthy smell of damp stone and aged timber. Your focus is drawn to a solitary figure, Brother Thomas. He is not a young man, his shoulders slightly stooped from years spent hunched over illuminated manuscripts. His eyes, though tired, still sharp and kind behind spectacles perched on his nose. He is a scholar, a copyist, a keeper of knowledge. His days are a rhythm of quiet dedication. Rising with the first bells, praying, eating simple meals in silence, and then, for hours, meticulously copying ancient texts in the scriptorium, his quill scratching softly against the vellum. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that medieval monasteries were not just places of worship. They were vital centers of learning and knowledge preservation. In an era before printing presses, monks like Brother Thomas were the human equivalent of photocopiers, painstakingly reproducing texts by hand, often taking years to complete a single Bible or classical work. Imagine the patience. Imagine the hand cramps. They were the true guardians of the past, ensuring that knowledge survived the often turbulent times. Brother Thomas's personal cell is Spartan, yet it's his sanctuary. A narrow cot, a small wooden table, and a single flickering oil lamp that casts dancing shadows on the stone walls are his only companions. He spends his evenings here, poring over complex theological treatises or practicing his intricate calligraphy, his mind absorbed in the wisdom of centuries past. You notice something, though, something subtle yet persistent, a tiny rustle behind the wainscoting, a fleeting shadow darting across the worn wooden floorboards. It's the kind of subtle disturbance you might dismiss as the building settling, or perhaps the wind playing tricks. But Brother Thomas, attuned to the minuscule sounds of his solitary existence, knows better. This quirky tidbit about monastic life. Despite the strict rules, tiny creatures often found ways to share the monks' austere living spaces, particularly mice, drawn by stray crumbs or the warmth of hearths. Historians still argue whether medieval monks truly tolerated these rodent residents, or if official records simply omitted the constant, losing battle against them. But for Brother Thomas, this particular minuscule intruder would soon become more than just a passing nuisance. It was the first quiet note in a symphony of the unexpected. The initial encounters with Brother Thomas's tiny cellmate were, as you might expect, quite unmonastic in their drama, if only on a miniature scale. You'd observe him, quill paused mid-stroke, listening intently to the faint scuttling, a barely audible scratching that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. It was an unwelcome guest, certainly. Monasteries, for all their sanctity, were still old buildings, and old buildings, especially those with pantries full of grain and libraries full of paper, were prime real estate for the common house mouse. This mainstream historical fact about medieval living conditions is that rodent infestations were a perpetual challenge, a battle fought with varying degrees of success through traps, cats, and sometimes resignation. Imagine trying to achieve spiritual enlightenment when you constantly hear tiny feet performing a tap dance behind your prayer book. Brother Thomas, a man of profound patience honed by years of meticulous copying, would attempt to dissuade the intruder. You might see him gently tapping a knuckle on the stone wall near the sound, a silent, almost apologetic request for quiet. Perhaps he'd even place a small, empty wooden bucket over the mouse hole, only to find it nudged aside by morning. He wasn't one for harsh measures. A swat with a broom felt rather unchristian, even for a pest. Besides, this mouse was particularly elusive, a fleeting shadow at the edge of his vision, gone before he could even properly focus. It was less of an infestation and more of a single, highly motivated, and very quiet tenant. The quirky tidbit here is that while official monastic rules often called for cleanliness and order, many monks secretly held a softer spot for animals, even vermin, viewing them as God's creatures. There are tales, though often exaggerated, of saints befriending wild animals. Historians still argue whether such leniency truly extended to commonplace pests, or if these stories were merely allegories. But for Brother Thomas, this particular mouse was becoming less of a pest and more of a presence, a silent, tiny companion in his otherwise solitary evenings. You might occasionally catch a glimpse of the mouse darting across the floorboards, its whiskers twitching, its beady eyes bright with curiosity. It seemed less interested in stray crumbs and more in the general atmosphere of the cell, almost as if it were observing Brother Thomas himself. Sometimes, in the quiet hours after Compline, when the entire monastery was bathed in a profound silence broken only by the distant hoot of an owl, you'd hear the mouse. A faint scratch, a tiny rustle of parchment. Brother Thomas would sigh, not in irritation, but almost with a resigned amusement. He knew it was there. The mouse knew he knew. It was a silent, unacknowledged truce, a tiny, furry negotiation in the vast, quiet expanse of medieval monastic life. He'd continue his work, the scratching of his quill now accompanied by the barely perceptible sounds of his tiny, uninvited roommate. It was a peculiar kind of shared solitude, where the human and the mouse, bound by the stillness of the night, became silent partners in the monastic rhythm. And you, observing this miniature ecosystem, would feel the profound quiet broken only by these faint, living sounds, a testament to life finding a way, even in the most disciplined of environments. As the seasons turned, and the chill of winter gave way to the gentle warmth of spring, the unspoken truce between Brother Thomas and his diminutive roommate deepened into an unusual, almost comforting, coexistence. You'd find yourself observing this peculiar domesticity, a tiny drama unfolding in the quiet solitude of his cell. The mouse, whom Brother Thomas had internally, perhaps whimsically, nicknamed Flicker, seemed to have learned the monk's routines. It would often appear only after Brother Thomas had settled down for his evening studies, a tiny, gray shadow emerging from a crevice near the fireplace, drawn by the dim glow of the oil lamp. Brother Thomas, for his part, had grown accustomed to Flicker's presence. He no longer tapped the walls or attempted to shoo him away. Instead, he might leave a tiny, almost imperceptible crumb of bread or a sliver of cheese from his meager supper near the wainscoting before retiring for the night. This mainstream historical fact reminds us that while monastic life was strictly disciplined, acts of small, personal kindness, even towards animals, were not uncommon, reflecting the Benedictine emphasis on charity and compassion for all creatures. It was a small act of grace in a life dedicated to a higher purpose, a tiny bridge between the human and the wild. The quirky tidbit here is that while mice were universally considered pests, stories occasionally emerged of individual monks or hermits developing peculiar bonds with wild animals, including rodents. These tales, often woven into hagiographies, lives of saints, depicted animals as responding to acts of kindness, sometimes even performing small favors in return. Historians still argue whether such stories were purely allegorical or if they contained kernels of truth, reflecting genuine human-animal interactions in isolated settings. But for Brother Thomas, it was less about allegory and more about the quiet companionship Flicker offered in the profound solitude of his cell. You'd watch Flicker, now bolder, scamper across the worn wooden table while Brother Thomas was absorbed in his work, its tiny whiskers twitching as it explored the familiar landscape of parchment and inkpots. It was an almost endearing sight, this miniature creature navigating the intellectual landscape of a scholar. There was a moment once when Brother Thomas, engrossed in a particularly challenging passage, inadvertently nudged his precious quill, sending it rolling towards the edge of the table. Before he could react, Flicker, with surprising agility, darted forward, its tiny paws nudging the quill back just enough to prevent it from tumbling to the floor. Brother Thomas blinked, then looked at the mouse, a slow smile spreading across his weary face. It was probably just an accident, a curious creature investigating an object, but in the quiet of the cell, it felt like a tiny act of assistance. It was like having a very small, very furry, and highly unexpected intern. This silent coexistence, a fragile truce in the eternal human-rodent conflict, was the bedrock of an even more extraordinary relationship that was about to unfold. The shared solitude, the silent truce, and even the occasional, seemingly accidental, assistance from Flicker began to lay the groundwork for a truly astonishing development. You'd notice Flicker's behavior evolving beyond mere coexistence. Its curiosity, initially focused on crumbs or the general ambience of the cell, started to gravitate towards Brother Thomas's most prized possessions, his books. The very objects that consumed Brother Thomas's days and evenings began to captivate the tiny mouse. You'd watch Flicker, no longer just scuttling along the floorboards, but now tentatively exploring the stacks of vellum-bound tomes piled near Brother Thomas's table. It would cautiously sniff the aged leather, its tiny nose twitching with what appeared to be genuine interest. Sometimes, it would even perch on the very edge of a large folio, its diminutive weight causing the pages to creak ever so slightly. This mainstream historical fact about medieval books is that they were incredibly valuable, often worth more than an entire farm. Each manuscript was a treasure, painstakingly copied and bound, and a single page could represent days or weeks of a monk's labor. So, a mouse showing interest in them was usually cause for alarm, not fascination. The quirky tidbit here is that while mice are notorious for nibbling books, a librarian's nightmare throughout history, some naturalists suggest that their curiosity can extend beyond just finding food. They are highly intelligent creatures, capable of exploring and recognizing patterns in their environment. Historians still argue whether medieval scholars ever truly documented instances of animal curiosity extending beyond mere destructive foraging, or if such observations were often dismissed as fanciful. But for Brother Thomas, there was something undeniably peculiar about Flicker's behavior. It wasn't just chewing, it was exploring. You might see Flicker, in the quiet of the evening, meticulously tracing the delicate calligraphy on a page with its nose, almost as if reading the words. Brother Thomas, initially dismissing it as mere happenstance, began to notice a pattern. Flicker seemed drawn to certain sections of certain books. Not the edges, not the binding, but the actual pages, particularly those with intricate illuminations or unusually bold script. It was a perplexing sight, a tiny rodent seemingly engaged in scholarly pursuits. You might even chuckle softly to yourself, thinking of a mouse wearing tiny spectacles, diligently poring over a theological text. It was utterly absurd, yet undeniably captivating. This developing curiosity was, for Brother Thomas, a strange mix of annoyance and fascination. On one hand, his precious books were at risk. On the other, he couldn't deny the unusual intelligence displayed by this tiny creature. It was as if Flicker was drawn not by hunger, but by the very essence of the knowledge contained within the ancient pages. This subtle shift, this newfound attention to the very heart of the monastery's purpose, was about to lead to a series of events that would change the course of Brother Thomas's peaceful existence, and indeed the fate of some very old, very important books. The peculiar interest Flicker displayed in the monastery's precious books, initially a curious novelty, began to morph into something more concerning. You'd notice the subtle signs first, tiny, almost imperceptible nibbles appearing on the very edges of valuable manuscripts. Not the destructive gnawing of a hungry pest trying to make a meal, but rather delicate, almost surgical nicks, as if testing the texture of the vellum itself. It was the kind of damage that, while small, sent a shiver down the spine of any diligent medieval librarian. Each manuscript, remember, was a unique work of art and scholarship, a hand-copied labor of love that could have taken years to complete. A single page, even a small corner, represented immense value, both intellectual and material. Brother Thomas, meticulous as he was, couldn't quite fathom it. These weren't the usual broad, destructive gnawing marks left by typical mice seeking sustenance or nesting material. These were precise, almost experimental bites. You might observe him, his brow furrowed in concentration, carefully examining the damaged sections under the weak light of his oil lamp, a magnifying glass, if he was fortunate enough to possess one, held close to the delicate parchment. He traced the tiny indentations with a finger, a perplexing puzzle. This mainstream historical fact about medieval libraries is that book damage from rodents, insects, and even dampness was a constant battle, and librarians went to great lengths to preserve their collections, often binding books in sturdy wood and metal to deter pests. But even the best bindings couldn't deter the most determined or curious of nibblers. The quirky tidbit here is that some historical accounts, though often apocryphal, speak of rodents causing damage to books not for food, but for curiosity or even for communication. One tale, for instance, tells of a mouse chewing a specific pattern into a scroll to reveal a hidden message. Historians still argue whether such selective damage could be indicative of intelligent behavior beyond mere instinct, or if it's simply a romanticized interpretation of random acts. But for Brother Thomas, these nibbles felt deliberate, almost like tiny, mischievous annotations. You might even catch Flicker in the act, or rather, just after the act. A tiny shadow darting away from a particularly ornate manuscript, leaving behind a fresh, tiny bite mark. Brother Thomas would sigh, not in anger, but in a peculiar mix of exasperation and continued bewilderment. He tried setting the simplest traps, small, humane devices that merely enclosed the mouse, but Flicker seemed to possess an uncanny ability to avoid them, almost as if it understood their purpose. It was like trying to outsmart a tiny, furry Houdini. The damage wasn't extensive enough to warrant extreme measures, but it was consistent, a subtle, persistent defacement of the monastery's most sacred treasures. It was a mystery, a tiny, parchment-chewing enigma, and Brother Thomas, despite his scholarly pursuits, found himself drawn into the peculiar intellectual challenge posed by his unassuming, nibbling cellmate. He knew he had to understand the why behind Flicker's strange habit before irreparable harm was done to the monastery's invaluable collection. The small, inexplicable nibbles on the edges of the precious manuscripts continued, a persistent, tiny riddle for Brother Thomas. You'd notice his frustration growing, not out of anger, but out of a deep concern for the monastery's irreplaceable collection. These weren't the haphazard chomps of a hungry scavenger. They were oddly precise, almost like punctuation marks in vellum. One evening, as the last rays of sunlight slanted through the narrow window of his cell, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, Brother Thomas made a peculiar discovery. He was meticulously examining a particularly ancient and weighty tome on celestial mechanics, a book so old its pages rustled like dried leaves. As he turned a page, his finger brushed against a tiny, almost invisible strand of what looked like mouse hair. But it wasn't just hair. It was clinging to a minuscule piece of parchment, a fragment so small it was barely visible, bearing a single, intricate, almost microscopic, ink mark. It was as if Flicker had taken a sample, a tiny souvenir of its nocturnal explorations. This mainstream historical fact highlights the fragility of medieval manuscripts, which were constantly at risk from environmental factors and biological degradation. Any foreign matter, even a tiny hair, was a cause for concern, meticulously removed to prevent further damage. The quirky tidbit here is that in some monastic traditions, scribes would occasionally make tiny, almost hidden marks or symbols in the margins of their copies, sometimes to indicate a particular passage or even just as a personal flourish. Historians still argue whether these marginalia sometimes included accidental transfers of material or if Brother Thomas's discovery was unique. But for Brother Thomas, this was no ordinary mousehair and parchment combo. He picked up the tiny fragment with the utmost care, holding it to the lamp. The ink mark on it, though barely visible, seemed to resemble a fragment of an initial capital, specifically from a very old, very distinct script used only in the oldest parts of the monastery's library. It was a minuscule clue, a breadcrumb trail left by a creature who surely had no idea of its significance. You would feel a prickle of excitement, a scholar's thrill at an unfolding mystery. This wasn't random destruction. This was selective. Brother Thomas meticulously compared the tiny ink mark to other known scripts, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He realized that the tiny mark on the hairlace fragment matched a script used in a very specific and rarely accessed section of the library's oldest archives. It was almost as if Flicker was leaving him a message, a bizarre, furry cartographer outlining an unknown route. This tiny, almost imperceptible piece of parchment, carried by a creature often dismissed as a mere pest, was the first concrete clue in understanding Flicker's peculiar project. It was like finding a single, perfectly formed, tiny piece of a jigsaw puzzle in a vast, dusty room, and knowing that somewhere, the rest of the pieces were waiting. The experiment with the vellum scraps left Brother Thomas with a profound realization. Flicker wasn't merely a destructive pest, but a creature with an uncanny, almost scholarly preference. You'd observe him no longer frustrated, but rather filled with a newfound awe and a growing sense of wonder. Flicker consistently chose the scraps that bore the ancient script, the very same script from which the initial mysterious fragment had come. It was as if the mouse had a nose for antiquity, a peculiar connoisseur of aged parchment. This selectivity was baffling. Why that specific type of vellum? Why that particular script? It wasn't the taste of the parchment itself, as all the scraps were chemically similar in terms of composition. It was something else, something subtle, almost undetectable to the human senses, that drew Flicker to these particular texts. The mainstream historical fact here is that medieval scribes often used different types of vellum, animal skin, and inks, which varied in quality and composition based on regional availability and specific monastic traditions. These variations could affect the texture, scent, and even subtle vibrational qualities of the parchment, though not in ways humans would readily perceive. But perhaps a tiny, highly sensitive mouse could. The quirky tidbit here is that animals, particularly rodents, possess an incredibly keen sense of smell, far surpassing that of humans. It's plausible that certain aged inks or vellum might develop unique olfactory signatures over centuries, akin to the complex bouquet of an old wine. Historians still argue whether such subtle environmental cues could truly guide an animal's preferences in such a precise, non-food-related manner, or if Brother Thomas was simply projecting human intellectual curiosity onto Flicker's behavior. But standing there, watching the tiny mouse repeatedly gravitate towards the ancient fragments, you'd be hard-pressed to deny something extraordinary was at play. You might even see Brother Thomas, in his quiet moments of contemplation, trying to detect a difference himself, sniffing the scraps of vellum, squinting at the faded ink, but finding nothing beyond the general scent of age and dust. He chuckles softly to himself, imagining Flicker as a tiny, discerning sommelier of historical documents. The mouse's peculiar preferences began to shape Brother Thomas's own research. He started to spend more time in the oldest, dustiest sections of the monastery's vast library, the very sections where manuscripts written in that specific ancient script were likely housed. He was following Flicker's lead, a scholar guided by the seemingly random whims of a rodent. It was an unconventional partnership, a silent, furry compass pointing towards forgotten knowledge. This unusual alliance, born from nibbled parchment and shared solitude, was about to lead Brother Thomas down a path he never expected, towards a discovery that had eluded generations of monks before him. Driven by Flicker's peculiar preferences, Brother Thomas delved deeper into the rarely accessed, dust-laden sections of the monastery's sprawling library. You'd find yourself accompanying him, your breath catching in the stale, cool air, the silence broken only by the soft rustle of ancient parchment as he carefully moved forgotten tomes. These were not the well-trodden paths of the main scriptorium, but a labyrinth of shelves stretching into shadowy corners, filled with books that hadn't seen the light of day in centuries. It was here, in this forgotten corner, that the next piece of Flicker's puzzle would unknowingly fall into place. Brother Thomas, guided by the specific script recognized from Flicker's chosen fragments, was painstakingly examining a row of particularly large, heavy folios, their leather bindings cracked with age. He was looking for any sign, any hint of the unique scent or texture that seemed to draw Flicker. He moved slowly, methodically, his fingers tracing the spines of the silent volumes. This mainstream historical fact about medieval monastic libraries is that they were often built incrementally, with new sections added as the collection grew, sometimes resulting in confusing layouts and forgotten alcoves. Important texts could genuinely be lost for centuries within their own walls, buried under layers of dust and newer acquisitions. Imagine a treasure hunt where the treasure is literally under your nose, but you need a very specific tiny guide. As Brother Thomas reached for a particularly weighty volume, nestled between two much smaller texts, he felt a subtle give, a slight shift in the seemingly solid wall behind the shelf. He paused, his eyes narrowing. It wasn't the usual creak of an old building. It felt different. He pushed gently, then with a bit more force on the spine of the book, and to your astonishment, a section of the bookshelf, not the book itself, slowly receded, revealing a dark, narrow opening behind it, a forgotten or secret passage. The quirky tidbit here is that many medieval castles and monasteries were built with hidden passages, secret rooms, and escape routes, often known only to a select few or forgotten over time. These secret architectural features served various purposes, from defense to clandestine meetings. Historians still argue whether such passages were always intentionally forgotten, or if their existence simply faded from collective memory over generations. But this one, opened by the accidental pressure of a monk searching for answers, was a genuine discovery. You could almost feel the rush of stale, cool air emanating from the newly revealed opening, carrying the scent of deeper dust and profound stillness. Brother Thomas recoiled slightly, then leaned forward, holding his flickering oil lamp into the darkness. The passage was narrow, almost too small for a man of his build, but it clearly led somewhere. It was a space that had been untouched for perhaps hundreds of years, a silent testament to forgotten architects and long-lost secrets. The silence that followed the grating sound of the moving shelf was profound, broken only by Brother Thomas's slightly ragged breathing. He stood on the precipice of a discovery, guided not by a map or an ancient riddle, but by the curious nibbles of a tiny mouse. The library, he realized, held more secrets than he, or any monk before him, had ever imagined. The discovery of the hidden passage behind the bookshelf filled Brother Thomas with a mixture of scholarly thrill and a touch of trepidation. You'd observe him, lamp held high, peering into the inky blackness, a profound sense of history washing over him. The air was heavy, ancient, untouched for centuries, smelling faintly of damp stone and undisturbed dust. The passage was narrow, leading downwards into what felt like the very bowels of the monastery, a secret forgotten even by the oldest abbots. He hesitated for only a moment, his sense of intellectual curiosity overcoming any natural apprehension. This mainstream historical fact about medieval monasteries is that they often contained hidden crypts, forgotten cells, or even subterranean tunnels, sometimes for practical reasons like storage or escape, but sometimes simply due to architectural evolution or the loss of original plans. These hidden spaces were ripe for accidental rediscovery, often yielding surprising finds. It was like finding a secret attic in your old house, only instead of dusty furniture, it held untold centuries of silence. Brother Thomas, carefully navigating the narrow, uneven steps, felt the cold of the stone through his thin sandals. The flickering light of his lamp danced on the rough-hewn walls, revealing nothing but bare rock and the occasional faint tremor from the distant bells of the monastery. He followed the passage as it twisted and turned, descending deeper until it opened into a small circular chamber. And there, in the center of the chamber, almost as if waiting to be found, lay a single wooden chest. It was old, incredibly old, its iron bands rusted, its wood warped and cracked. The quirky tidbit here is that throughout history, discoveries of hidden chambers or forgotten chests in ancient buildings often fueled tales of lost treasures or magical artifacts. While most were mundane, the allure of the unknown always persisted. Historians still argue whether such hidden caches were always deliberate, or if some were simply overlooked during renovations or abandonment. But for Brother Thomas, this chest, in this forgotten chamber, was more precious than any king's ransom. With trembling hands, he managed to pry open the rusted clasp. Inside, nestled amongst layers of ancient, decaying cloth, was not gold or jewels, but something far more valuable to a scholar: a collection of scrolls and a single, beautifully illuminated manuscript. The vellum of the manuscript was yellowed with age, but the ink, surprisingly, remained vibrant, the colors of the illuminations still rich and deep. Brother Thomas gasped softly. He carefully lifted one of the scrolls, and there, unmistakable, was the very ancient script, the precise, intricate handwriting that Flicker had been drawn to. It was a language of symbols and archaic flourishes, distinct from anything currently copied in the scriptorium. He recognized it instantly from the tiny fragment the mouse had left. This was it. This was the source of Flicker's fascination, the hidden heart of the monastery's forgotten knowledge. The air in the small chamber seemed to hum with the weight of rediscovered history, a silent testament to the long-lost texts now brought back to light by the improbable curiosity of a tiny mouse. The rediscovery of the long-lost manuscript and scrolls in the hidden chamber was a momentous occasion for Brother Thomas and, by extension, the Abbey of St. Martin. You'd observe him emerging from the narrow passage, dust clinging to his robes, his face alight with a quiet, scholarly triumph, clutching the ancient texts as if they were spun gold. The air in the main library, usually so still, now seemed to vibrate with the sheer weight of this newfound knowledge. This was not merely finding an old book. This was unearthing a piece of forgotten history, potentially revealing missing links in theological understanding or even lost secular wisdom. The scrolls, carefully unrolled on a clean, wide table in the scriptorium, revealed treatises on forgotten astronomical theories, philosophical debates from a long-vanished school of thought, and even peculiar medical observations that had likely been deemed heretical or simply too obscure to preserve in later centuries. The beautifully illuminated manuscript, however, was the true jewel. Its pages detailed an early, almost mythological, history of the abbey itself, including accounts of its founding by a saint whose existence had long been debated, believed by many to be mere legend. This mainstream historical fact about medieval monastic libraries is that their collections were often eclectic, containing not just religious texts but also scientific, philosophical, and classical works, sometimes in volumes that had been lost elsewhere. Imagine discovering a lost Shakespeare play in your grandmother's attic. The quirky tidbit here is that before the advent of critical historical analysis, the lines between fact, folklore, and divine revelation were often blurred in medieval chronicles. A newly found text, especially one detailing the origins of a holy site, could profoundly impact the monastery's prestige and even its land claims. Historians still argue whether such rediscoveries were always genuine, or if some were cleverly fabricated to bolster a monastery's standing. But for Brother Thomas, there was no doubt. The script, the vellum, the very age of the texts all spoke of authenticity. He felt a profound connection to the ancient scribes who had created these works, their voices now echoing through the centuries thanks to Flicker. You might even see him, after days of meticulous examination, excitedly, though still quietly in the monastic way, showing key passages to the abbot. His voice filled with awe and a touch of disbelief. The abbot, initially skeptical, would pore over the exquisite illuminations and the archaic script, his stern face slowly softening into a look of profound wonder. The implications were vast. The monastery now possessed unique, invaluable insights into its own past, shedding light on its very foundations and its role in regional history. It would attract scholars, pilgrims, and perhaps even royal patronage. All this thanks to a tiny mouse with a discerning palate for ancient vellum. The quiet hum of the monastery was about to get a little louder, filled with the murmurs of new discoveries and the rustle of turning ancient pages. And you, observing the unfolding of this historical revelation, would feel the thrill of a secret long kept, finally brought to light by the most unexpected of librarians. The unearthing of the long-lost texts, a direct result of Flicker's peculiar nibbles and Brother Thomas's astute observation, brought about an unexpected transformation within the Abbey of St. Martin. You'd witness the subtle, yet profound, shift in the monastery's atmosphere. The abbot, usually a man of sober demeanor, now carried a distinct spring in his step. The scriptorium, once a place of quiet, methodical copying, buzzed with a newfound energy, albeit still a quiet, scholarly buzz. The monastery, almost overnight, gained a reputation. Scholars from distant lands began to arrive, drawn by the whispers of the lost texts, rediscovered within its ancient walls. They came with their own quills and parchment, eager to study the unique astronomical theories, the forgotten philosophies, and especially the detailed early history of the abbey itself. This mainstream historical fact highlights how the possession of rare and valuable manuscripts could significantly elevate a monastery's prestige and influence during the medieval period, transforming it into a prominent center of learning and pilgrimage. It was like a sleepy, unassuming library suddenly discovering it owned the original manuscript of a literary masterpiece. And at the heart of this transformation, though largely unseen by the visiting scholars, was Flicker. Brother Thomas, recognizing the mouse's invaluable contribution, lobbied the abbot for a special honorary role for his tiny accomplice. You might imagine the abbot's initial raised eyebrow, a faint flicker of amusement on his usually solemn face. But Brother Thomas was persistent, explaining the precise role Flicker's unusual preferences had played. And so, in a decision as unique as the discovery itself, Flicker was officially, if symbolically, granted the title of librarian's assistant. The quirky tidbit here is that while animals often lived within monastic walls, an official position for a mouse was utterly unprecedented. Historians still argue whether such a whimsical appointment was ever truly formalized in any historical monastery, or if it remained an endearing legend within the abbey itself. But for Brother Thomas, it was real. You'd occasionally see him leaving tiny, almost imperceptible crumbs of consecrated bread, crumbs only, of course, lest they be seen as wasteful, near the specific shelf where the rediscovered texts were now kept, a silent offering to his tiny assistant. It was a charming, almost absurd act of gratitude, a recognition of the profound debt owed to a creature usually destined for the trap. Flicker's role wasn't one of daily duties, of course. He didn't stamp books or scold overdue borrowers. Rather, his presence served as a constant, quiet reminder of the unexpected paths to knowledge. He remained in Brother Thomas's cell, a silent, furry guardian, now seemingly content with the occasional, deliberate crumb, his nibbling habits either sated by his great discovery or simply brought under control by the sheer respect for the library he had helped enrich. The monastery had found its fame, and Brother Thomas, his quiet pride, all thanks to the tiniest, most unlikely of librarians. The extraordinary tale of Flicker, the mouse who became an honorary librarian, instilled a subtle but significant lesson within the ancient walls of the Abbey of St. Martin. You'd observe a newfound humility among the monks, particularly the younger ones, who had once taken the vast library for granted, perhaps even viewing its dusty corners with a touch of disdain. Brother Thomas, though never boastful, would occasionally share the full story of Flicker's role in the discovery, emphasizing the unexpected ways in which knowledge can be revealed and the profound value of even the smallest creatures. This mainstream historical fact about medieval monasticism is that humility and the recognition of God's hand in all creation were core tenets. The story of Flicker served as a tangible, living example of these principles, reminding the monks that wisdom could come from the most unlikely sources. It was a tangible, furry parable, more impactful than any sermon. You might see a novice monk, initially inclined to swat a fly, now pausing, perhaps even guiding it gently out of his cell, a quiet testament to the lesson learned from the mouse. The quirky tidbit here is that in some philosophical traditions, animals were believed to possess a kind of innate wisdom or connection to nature that humans had lost. While not explicitly theological, the idea that a mouse could lead to such a significant discovery certainly reinforced a sense of wonder at the natural world. Historians still argue whether such lessons from nature truly altered daily monastic practices significantly, or if they primarily served as inspiring anecdotes. But for the monks of St. Martin, Flicker's story was a constant, whispered reminder. Pay attention, for profound truths might be hidden in plain sight, revealed by the most humble of beings. You would notice the way the monks, especially Brother Thomas, now looked at the world around them, no longer just focused on the grand texts and the lofty prayers, but with a heightened awareness for the subtle movements in the shadows, the tiny rustles, the barely perceptible sounds of life. They learned patience from Flicker's meticulous curiosity and humility from his unexpected intellect. It was a lesson in observation, a reminder that prejudice against the small or seemingly insignificant could lead to missing out on immense value. Brother Thomas often remarked that the mouse had taught him more about open-mindedness than many years of formal study. It was like finally learning that the quietest person in the room often has the most insightful things to say. The monastery, once a rigid bastion of human intellect, had opened its mind, however slightly, to the wisdom of the natural world, all thanks to its tiny, four-legged librarian. And you, observing this subtle shift in perspective, could feel the warmth of a community learning to appreciate the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary. The tale of the tiny mouse who became an honorary librarian was too extraordinary to remain confined within the thick stone walls of the Abbey of St. Martin. You'd find yourself hearing its echoes far beyond the secluded valley, carried by traveling merchants, curious pilgrims, and even other monks who visited the now-famous library. The story spread, evolving with each telling, becoming a cherished legend. It would be recounted in hushed tones around crackling hearths in distant villages, children listening with wide eyes, envisioning a miniature, scholarly mouse poring over ancient texts. Mainstream historical fact shows that stories of miraculous events or unusual occurrences within monasteries often circulated widely, contributing to their reputation and attracting visitors or benefactors. These narratives, whether entirely true or embellished, served to reinforce the spiritual and intellectual standing of the institutions. It was the medieval equivalent of a heartwarming viral video, but with more vellum and fewer cat names. The quirky tidbit here is that while the monastery itself would likely emphasize the divine providence in the discovery, the common folk might romanticize Flicker's intelligence, imagining a mouse with human-like understanding, almost a magical creature. Historians still argue whether such popular interpretations of monastic events ever truly influence broader religious beliefs, or if they remain charming, peripheral tales. But for the average person, struggling with daily life, the idea of a tiny creature achieving such importance offered a comforting sense of wonder and possibility. You might even see itinerant storytellers, their voices rich with dramatic flair, weaving the legend of Brother Thomas's little helper into their repertoire, perhaps adding a flourish where Flicker would outsmart a grumpy, book-hating cat or reveal a hidden passage to a lost treasure, which, while not gold, was certainly true in its own way. The whispers of the legend ensured that the Abbey of St. Martin remained a place of particular interest, not just for its restored ancient texts, but for the charming, unlikely hero who helped bring them to light. The story became a testament to the monastery's wisdom and a gentle reminder that even the smallest beings could hold immense power. The legacy wasn't just in the recovered scrolls. It was in the enduring whispered tale that lived on in the hearts and minds of people far and wide, a quiet testament to the enduring power of a good story, especially one starring a tiny, intelligent mouse. The tale of Flicker, the little mouse who unearthed forgotten wisdom, settled into a quiet corner of history, leaving an indelible, whimsical mark. You'd feel its presence, not as a thunderous roar, but as a soft, comforting hum, a reminder that significance often comes in the smallest packages. The Abbey of St. Martin continued its scholarly pursuits, its library enriched, its monks ever mindful of the unexpected paths to knowledge. Brother Thomas lived out his days, a revered figure, his quiet pride in his tiny assistant unwavering. Flicker, the humble librarian, eventually passed into the quiet slumber of all creatures, but its story, like the ancient vellum it helped rediscover, was preserved. The mainstream historical fact here is that many seemingly minor events or figures from the past, once documented, can continue to influence narratives and perceptions for centuries, demonstrating the enduring power of recorded history, no matter how small the initial spark. It's like a tiny pebble causing ripples across a vast, still pond. The quirky tidbit about this is how such specific, localized anecdotes can become universally endearing, transcending cultural and temporal boundaries to resonate with people across different eras. Historians still argue whether such stories are most valuable as literal history or as insights into the values and beliefs of the time they were told. But for us, the enduring legacy of this tiny mouse isn't about precise historical verification. It's about the subtle beauty of unexpected connections. The monastery never forgot its unusual librarian. You might imagine a tiny, carefully carved mouse figurine, perhaps placed discreetly on a shelf in the newly organized archives. A silent, humble tribute to the creature that helped bring so much to life. The tale of Flicker, the mouse who became a librarian, became a gentle whisper through the centuries, a reminder that true value often lies not in grandeur or power, but in quiet curiosity, persistent effort, and the unexpected friendships that blossom in the most unlikely of places. It's a testament to the idea that even a tiny nibble can lead to a monumental discovery, and that sometimes the greatest helpers are the ones you least expect. As the last echoes of Flicker's story fade, imagine the quiet of the night descending around you, the soft rustle of leaves outside your window, the distant whisper of the wind. Allow your thoughts to drift, gentle and unburdened, just like the forgotten secrets of a long-ago library. Let the soft, lingering images of dusty scrolls and tiny paws guide you deeper into comfort. The stories of the past, like ancient lullabies, are here to guide you to a peaceful rest. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the gentle hum of sleep wash over you, knowing that some of the most profound truths are found in the most humble of tales.